Okay. All right, so with that, folks, we are at 11:59. I'm going to open up the room and we will be off to the races.
Thanks, Tamara.
Thank you, and thank you all. So welcome everyone to the New York Space Business Roundtable. We are honored to have you here. I'm going to open the floor to Mr. Louis Zaccarilla, who will give us a warm and welcoming introduction.
Well, thank you, Tamara, and also thank you to the Banderist Chorus of Ukraine. You heard a little bit of a clip from one of their songs called Ash Trees, so we thought that would be appropriate to start us off today. Well, asked to define the current regime in Russia, New York University professor here and author Nina Khrushcheva, who happened to be the great-granddaughter and adoptive granddaughter of former Russian leader Nikita Khrushchev, said, "The more blood it spills, the more blood it wants." Well, stalemate blood and, probably oddly to many, satellite technology have in large part defined this war, which has all of Europe and much of the world on edge. The battle for the freedom of Ukraine has turned from a moral argument, which is settled for most everyone in Europe, to whether a nation so outgunned with a smaller population can, like Britain in the early 1940s, survive through innovation and the kindness of allies and strangers. That determination will come to pass perhaps sooner rather than later, many believe. At this time, the space and satellite industry will play a role that is unimagined and was unimagined a generation before. Well, today, we have people who will help us see how that is taking shape through a remarkable discussion about Ukraine and satellites. But before we get into that, I want to thank our sponsors and supporting organizations. And we really appreciate the sponsors who have come back to be part of this organization and to make this a possibility. So special thanks to them. We also have a pretty significant group of supporting organizations this year, and we're very pleased that they're joining us. A special shout out to the U.S.-India Business Council under the direction of Jay Gullish for their support here, along with all of the others. And as you see there, our media partner for the year 2024 is again Space News Magazine. And as we do each month, we begin our program with the Significant Digits Report from Space News Magazine's Deborah Werner. Deborah, welcome.
Thank you, Lou. Nice to be here.
Well, it's great to see you. And, thank you for being a part of this, what we think is a very important conversation. Deborah, I wanted to turn it over to you this morning for the Significant Digits Report to start us off, just by giving us your take from your reporting on what is happening with regard to the commercial sector of our business working with the government or military sector.
So I think this conversation about Ukraine is very important to what's happening in the commercial space sector in general, because one of the first things that we saw in Ukraine was the attack on infrastructure. Viasat modems went down. Tens of thousands of Viasat modems were hurt with a malware attack shortly before the invasion. There was Starlink jamming and hacking. Starlink, of course, is the SpaceX satellite communications constellation. An undersea cable that was very important to satellite communications was also cut shortly before the war. And so one bucket is the attacks that we have seen on infrastructure, which brought up the whole conversation of how should those commercial assets be defended if, in fact, they are very important to national activities like military activities and supporting our allies. In addition, I don't have to tell people here the role that Maxar and other commercial satellites played in providing imagery and data that revealed what was happening and countered Russian propaganda. When Russia was saying it had no intention of invading, those images splashed across every newspaper and social media site showed the armed forces lined up at the border. And military officials around the world have talked about how important that was because they could be shared readily. There was no huge process for declassifying imagery. They just were shared around the world and people could see what was happening. So I think that was very important. We learned about synthetic aperture radar imagery. Some of us already knew how important it was because it can see through clouds and darkness, but suddenly it was all over the news media and popular media showing what was happening on the ground. And the last thing I'll say is that the US and the allies have responded to what's happened in Ukraine. They've looked at the lessons learned and awarded more contracts, and they're looking at ways to share imagery and data more easily. I think it really showed what commercial imagery can do combined with the government assets.
Yeah, thanks, Deborah. And that's a great setup, by the way, for us. One question I did have, Vera Bergengruen from Time Magazine, who we'll be hearing from later on the panel, reported in a cover story in Time on AI in Ukraine, the degree to which Silicon Valley companies have just en masse gone to Ukraine and offered all kinds of services in the tech realm. Has your reporting out of Silicon Valley touched on that at all? Or are you aware that the degree to which Palantir and Microsoft and even smaller companies have gone over there to help out?
No, I'm looking forward to hearing about that.
Yeah,
that's interesting.
yeah, it was a surprise, and I didn't know until I read her piece. So we always learn from you guys when we read your articles. Anything you're working on for the future? I know we've got the satellite conference coming up.
Yes, and speaking of AI, we really are exploring AI in space. Much of the AI and machine learning has taken place on the ground, related to space, related to imagery and data and analytics. But there's a big push right now to bring it on board satellites, which is not always easy given its power demands and memory demands, but people are figuring it out when they need to.
Yeah, we'll be looking forward to that. Deborah, I hope you stick around, and thanks again for starting us off.
You're welcome.
Good to see you. What Deborah was describing is sort of the new art of war. We are in a new area, a new realm of warfare where the old, the brutal, and the new, the tech are sort of merging, and no one's quite sure what's going to come out of this. But the art of war has been with us for a long time, and the SSPI has produced a brand new Better Satellite World video called The Art of War, which we'd like to share with you before we go to our panel. Oh, nice curtains.
The South China Sea is a triangle of ocean bordered by Vietnam, the Philippines, Taiwan, Indonesia, and China. In 1988, strange things started happening there. China's Navy fired on 3 Vietnamese vessels, sinking them and killing 74 sailors. The dispute was over China's claim to a group of mostly uninhabited islands far beyond its territorial waters. But in China's view, the entire South China Sea was its exclusive property. It made that clear in another battle with a Philippine Navy gunboat. Then everything went quiet. Until years later, China began building forts and airfields on island reefs scattered across the sea. Strange behavior? Not to one of the most famous generals in Chinese history. Sun Tzu, born 2,500 years ago, is famous for writing a short book called The Art of War. It teaches that wars can be won without fighting battles. They can be won, for example, by taking possession of small islands and showing you are willing to fight for them, without doing much fighting at all. Take China's maritime militia. It's made up of hundreds of fishing boats that have surged out of harbors to surround disputed islands and menace US Navy warships. They claim to be patriotic captains defending their nation's rightful claims to the whole South China Sea. But are they? A company called UltiSat Space wanted to find out. UltiSat builds data systems that automatically analyze radar images captured by satellite. By automating the process, UltiSat can analyze thousands of images taken over months and years, and that specialty was a perfect match for the problem. The South China Sea is hidden by clouds for half the year. Radar ignores both clouds and darkness, and easily detects the steel hulls of fishing boats. The UltiSat Space analysis revealed an invisible navy in ports across China's southwest coast. More than 150 fishing boats would form up into armadas in port and set sail together. UltiSat tracked their voyages to the sea's disputed zones, even when ships turned off their legally required radio trackers. In fact, ships without tracking signals were easier to identify as members of the maritime militia. A report from the Center for Strategic and International Studies revealed that the Chinese government was paying the militia to cover their operating costs. Rather than being humble fishermen fired by zeal for their country, the captains seemed to be on the government payroll. China is hardly the first nation to claim territory beyond its borders. Its Asian neighbors have claims of their own, and there's a reason why the Western Pacific between Hawaii and the Philippines was known as America's Lake. But satellite technology and companies like UltiSat Space ensure that countries trying to win wars without fighting can no longer do it out of the world's view. Space and satellite, the world's invisible, indispensable technologies. Brought to you by Space and Satellite Professionals International, with the support of UltiSat Space Systems.
And if those restaurants in Asia were wondering why they weren't getting the oysters and the bluefish, well, now they know. Thanks to UltiSat Space, and thanks to UltiSat for helping us produce that video. And what you just saw will be familiar to the people on our panel today with regard to the analytics from space, and again, how important our industry is to creating this sense of global transparency about those types of things. So let me introduce the people who will be with us today, and we can get going. I would like to first welcome Stephen Wood. Stephen is the Senior Director with Maxar News Bureau. The Bureau supports media organizations worldwide using satellite technology to complement quality journalism in its ongoing search for fact-based evidence. Maxar News Bureau provided high-resolution satellite imagery and analysis for the New York Times Pulitzer Prize-winning report on Russia's use of shadow warfare. Mr. Wood's group was the primary source of information during the Russian invasion of Ukraine, giving the world the first evidence of a Russian military convoy heading towards the heart of Ukraine. No one knew much about the convoy's advances or how much equipment it carried until Maxar distributed those images. And Maxar continues to provide an unbiased view of the war, and we'll ask Stephen about that in our conversation. Of note, Maxar News Bureau received the 2023 Better Satellite World Award in London from SSPI. Mr. Wood has many decades experience analyzing satellite imagery and doing multi-source analysis. He joined Digital Globe after 14 years in the United States government, where he held a range of senior imagery intelligence positions. He was also the co-founder of All Source Analysis, a US-based imagery analytic company. There is no better authority in this field than Stephen Wood. Stephen, welcome to the roundtable.
Thank you, Lou. It's great to be talking with you again and really look forward to our panel discussion today.
Well, likewise. After successful stints with Peraton and CEO of DataPath, where he led the public to private spin out of a Rockwell Collins division into an independent company serving the defense industry, Mr. David Myers was hired by UltiSat as its president and CEO. For those of you who don't know about UltiSat, it's a provider of managed networks, cybersecurity services, and advanced engineering and technical services for customers in the defense, national security, civil government, humanitarian aid, and critical infrastructure markets. And that includes, of course, satellite and wireless networks. David has won multiple awards and accolades and served as chairman of SSPI, which he'll admit was probably his hardest job. He is the author of a soon-to-be-published book, Space with a Private View. And having had a sneak peek at that book, it is the definitive and very easy to read primer on commercial Earth observation and remote sensing. And it's a perfect gift for today's roundtable viewers. David, welcome.
Thank you very much, Lou. Appreciate the opportunity to be on this panel and talk about a very timely topic in the space industry.
Absolutely. We look forward to the conversation. Next up, Vera Bergengruen is a senior correspondent at Time Magazine. Based in the Washington, D.C. bureau, she covers the overlap of national security, politics, and tech. Her work won for her the Society of Professional Journalists Sigma Delta Chi Award and the New York Press Club Award. Vera's reporting from Kiev has been nothing short of remarkable, and I'm sure she's going to be winning awards for that, with stories ranging from how the city's IT department redeployed to keep citizens and schools safe and informed during the early attacks of the war, to her two recent articles this month on Russia's space-based weapons, and her incredible cover story on how the global tech sector and AI have gone to war. Vera had a family issue today, which has her on a plane at the moment, but we caught up with her early this morning for this conversation to start off the panel.
So I'm here with Vera Bergengruen. Vera, just your cover story on AI in Ukraine was just incredible. It really blew our minds about how much is going on with regard to the commercial and the governmental working together. And I suspect a lot of it is just brand new. I mean, the way you wrote it, this is really a living experiment. But I wanted to ask you, you saw the commercial sector just kind of rushing in and doing things again that were on the fly. You wrote about an IT army of volunteer hackers, all different kinds of things. But what I wanted to ask you was, first of all, what did you see, what did you observe or hear about the way satellite and data analytics were being used in this process? And what blew you away about what you were reporting there?
Yeah, so it's really fascinating. As you know, a not particularly technical person in that regard, but with a background in national security, being shown all these things that I was used to in my mind as being relegated to a Manhattan Project style bunker with a bunch of government agents, and really it just being commercial technologies, mainly off the shelf. For example, you know, satellite imagery, just different layers and layers of information, everything from, again, the speed with which now you can gather a lot of this satellite imagery that was completely impossible in the past through some of these commercial companies, and then kind of just overlaying it with layers from everything from, you know, Ukrainian government data to reports that Ukrainians were sending from the ground, you know, because every Ukrainian basically is using their smartphone as as almost like becoming a part of the war effort, right? So if they see a Russian tank, they're taking a photo, uploading it to the same app that they were using to pay parking tickets a while ago, and the government has that. And so using these data analytic systems to overlay all of these layers on top of commercially available satellite imagery was just incredibly impressive because of the speed, right? Because I know, at least the way it was explained to me in the past, you had to, if you wanted to get a clear picture of a particular part of, of the Ukrainian battlefield, it might take up to a day, even two. You had to wait for everything to be, lining up in the right way. You had to send out the requests to the different commercial companies to get this to you. And by kind of having these, I obviously wrote more specifically about Palantir Technologies, but by having these companies that pull all of this, it's really shortened that cycle by so much that now commanders have got it almost, it's not a real-time picture. I was cautioned it's a near real-time picture, but a very accurate digital image of the battlefield. And obviously, commercial satellite imagery is a really big part of that.
Yeah. Speaking of Palantir, I also wanted to just allude to something you wrote that, again, is what we would call a better satellite world activity. And you were talking about, I think, the Minister of Science showing you dashboards with satellite maps tracking schools that have been affected by air raid alerts or power outages, all kinds of stuff that someone referred to as it's like a superpower. It's helping the citizens. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so that was really fascinating because I kind of went in with, just given the urgency of the situation and the stalemate that the war is in, I went in with the idea of really having only military purposes. You think of kind of satellite imagery and AI-enabled software, and you kind of just think of killer robots, targeting Russian positions or something like that. Obviously, I went in with the military part in mind, but it's a massive country of more than 40 million people living through a war, and all of this is being used, especially a lot of satellite imagery and using AI models to process it is being used just to help the country live through this war. And so, as you mentioned, the Minister of Education and Science showed me how they were using all of this to figure out, which schools were being affected by everything from blackouts to air raids. They're still trying to get just testing, just national standardized testing, same as here, going so that this generation doesn't miss out on years of schooling. And being able to use all of this data, and including, again, these images, to figure out which schools should remain open, which roads are clear, how can we make this the most efficient way possible so that people can access them. And the other thing that struck me the most was really the use for humanitarian demining, which is something that I think we kind of aren't as aware of, but Ukraine is now the most heavily mined country on earth.
Right.
And it's not only a danger to people, obviously, but to, it's really making so much of their farmland completely unusable, which is incredibly, just problematic and dangerous for many reasons. And so being able to use all of the satellite imagery and all of this, through these data analytics systems to figure out, okay, which areas are, seem to be the most heavily mined, because a lot of this is kind of a guessing game. And where can we deploy our demining teams, which are very limited and often working under fire and in very dangerous conditions? Where can they have the biggest impact? Because they're telling me it's going to take up to 700 years in normal circumstances to demine the entire country. They're still dealing with, World War II style mines. And so you being able to use satellite imagery and again, overlaid with these layers of data of a farmer saying, this is what I saw here, here's like a thermal picture showing where something went off, to realize where they can actually, most efficiently deploy resources. They've got pretty ambitious plans to demine the whole country in a decade, and this is completely impossible without all of these tools.
Yeah. And, what you also set up in your piece is that, and of course, Ukraine is such a fertile place for agriculture. It's really setting up for after the war. And I was really struck by how they're thinking about the country after the war and the degree to which it will have a combined commercial government relationship in the tech sector. You had referred to a program called a digital platform called Brave One, where Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so Brave One is kind of, the Ukrainian government was a little overwhelmed with just a huge amount of offers from all kinds of, from big companies to small, from foreign to domestic, offering to deploy their products for the war effort. So you had everything from Google, Amazon, Microsoft offering to give them all these tools, Palantir, all the way to small drone makers and small companies trying to supply them with all this stuff. And Brave One is a platform that they came up with where all these, again, everything from a startup to a big commercial company can kind of pitch these projects or offer any tools to the Ukrainian government, and they test them, they figure out what works, what is filling some critical need, and then they can kind of scale them and deploy them on the battlefield. And it's a microcosm, as you alluded to, of what they're hoping the country to be able to do in the future. So they're hoping that, Ukraine is going to become, in their words, kind of the next Israel. But what they mean by that is,
Right.
A hotbed of military technology that is testing the very cutting edge tech. But really, as you mentioned, a commercial and government, partnership that we haven't quite seen in the past. I mean, obviously, industry has always been a huge part in wartime of supplying their countries, technological needs. But now, a lot of these companies have most of the technology, and a lot of these, they're independent actors. A lot of these companies have more power than most countries on earth in terms of the technological innovation that they can supply to a war. And so by combining it with, for example, the government, which is the one that gives them access to the battlefield and to this very valuable opportunity to improve and refine their products, that partnership is clearly the future. I mean, we're seeing it now in Taiwan, where they're citing Ukraine as an example and partnering with commercial space companies and all these other tech companies to basically bring them in and help them design their own drone program and their own kind of AI-enabled analytics tools. So, I mean, clearly that's the future. Whether that's a good thing or bad, a lot of nervous national security types are debating that right now.
Well, it's one of those situations where, remarkably, they've had over 1,100 submissions, according to your reporting, and hundreds are being tested. It reminded me of what I read about the United Kingdom, England, during the first part of World War II. I mean, you just try everything, right? Because you're under such threat.
I think we lost the sound, Tamara.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, let's try that again. Sorry about that.
So I'm here with Vera.
No.
That partnership is clearly the future. I mean, we're seeing it now in Taiwan, where they're citing Ukraine as an example and partnering with commercial space companies and all these other tech companies to basically bring them in and help them design their own drone program and their own kind of AI-enabled analytics tools. So, I mean, clearly that's the future. Whether that's a good thing or bad, a lot of nervous national security types are debating that right now.
Well, it's one of those situations where, remarkably, they've had over 1,100 submissions, according to your reporting, and hundreds are being tested. It reminded me of what I read about the United Kingdom, England, during the first part of World War II. I mean, you just try everything, right? Because you're under such threat.
And that is the end.
Okay, thanks, Tamara. There is more to that. She did some reporting on the Russian anti-satellite capabilities, which we can play for you later. There's a longer conversation that will be a podcast, which we'll let you know about. But we wanted to just have Vera comment on her cover story on AI and talk to you a little bit about what she saw on the ground. Stephen, I'm going to start off with you on that, because a lot of what she was saying kind of reflects Maxar News Bureau's work to enable the journalists like her to acknowledge and report on what's happening there. First of all, what was your reaction to what you heard? And then talk to us a little bit about what the News Bureau is doing as part of that effort now in real time on February 21st, 2024.
Yeah, you bet. So between both what Vera said as well as Deborah at the very beginning, it rang true with a lot of the things that I've been thinking about and frankly that we've been living through for the past couple of years. You know, I thought about it this morning. We're 72 hours away from the second anniversary of the actual beginning of the war. It's incredible. You know, I mean, to me, I think back of some of the bigger events that we covered over the past 2 years, and frankly are still covering today. You know, we just looked at the town of Avdiivka in Ukraine that was just recently captured by the Russian forces. And as I was preparing imagery, I was thinking about it and talking with one of the media correspondents about it. After a while, frankly, unfortunately, these cities all in the towns become somewhat familiar. You look at Bakhmut from a year ago, you look at Avdiivka today, you look at Mariupol 2 years ago. You know, this is a story that continues on. Perhaps more relevant for this panel and this discussion, is this indeed the role of commercial satellite imagery and what we can play to help shed some transparency on what's happening? And really, ultimately, that's been our core function from the very beginning, not just with the war in Ukraine, of course, but with other events around the world. The video that you showed at the very beginning with the South China Sea is another very relevant current example of how do you take this technology that is just continually getting better and better, both from an industry as well as from our own company perspective, and use it for an ability to explain, to visually show, to help journalists, to help investigative reporters, to help documentarians, just from the publication perspective and the kind of the media perspective, shed some light on things that are happening in the world. You know, one of the real advantages of what we do is we can go anywhere in the world. You know, we're not limited by boundaries, by borders, by how dangerous the area might be, how desolate it might be. Our satellites can see these things. And we're now at the level of human scale activity from space where we can actually monitor, see, explain things that are happening. And the war in Ukraine to me, has been unprecedented and continues to be that way. But just look around the globe, you know, see what's happening today, from the situation in Israel and Gaza to, again, the South China Sea to natural disasters. To me, that's always been one of the real compelling components about this dual use technology. Yes, there's unquestionably a role for militaries, for intelligence purposes, but it's the humanitarian side. It's the reconstruction side of what's going to happen in Ukraine. Right. It's looking at cultural sites that have been horribly demolished in the war and chronicling that and detailing it in a way that people can understand. So very, very dynamic situation continues. Yeah, look like you have a question for me, Lou.
Well, I was just going to say, and as I think Vera said, it condenses the time frame in terms of when you can get things done. I mean, clearing out a minefield that would normally take 700 years to a decade is important. So what do you see now in terms of being able to continue to monitor Ukraine and maybe shorten timeframes for journalists? Where do you see the impact coming? Although I know you obviously try to be neutral on this.
Yeah, no, I mean, you raise a couple of really important points. For one, if you look back over the past decade or so, that timeline of getting relevant information in the hands of journalists has dramatically improved. Of course, we're doing that for all of our other customers. There's a lot of, very tactical as well as strategic reasons to get imagery from space into the ground, into a user, most importantly, as fast as you possibly can. And I've seen that literally going from, in my time frame in our companies, from a couple of days down to hours. And we're always working on getting that better. This news is perishable and continues to be information that needs to get in the hands of people as quickly as possible. So that the timelines are getting better with more technology, more assets that are on the ground or in space. That I think that's a evolving situation for the better. That'll continue to improve.
Do you go right to the device? Could you go right to a journalist device?
We can. I mean, we have all kinds of handheld capabilities where we're actually going from a satellite image into kind of a ruggedized device that a military officer might use in the field to a cell phone, you name it.
Yep. Very good. Thanks, Stephen. David, obviously all of this is familiar to you as well, given your background. I've got two questions for you as well. First question, what was your reaction to what you heard from Vera? Anything surprise you there? Or?
No, I think she makes a really interesting point about the role of commercial satellite in variety of forms and how, to some extent, it levels the playing field for a country that doesn't have any space assets of its own, right? And when you think about Ukraine, right, it's not, the Earth imaging, of course, was one of the first things that we all saw in the news, the Maxar imagery showing Russian artillery and armor and troops, filing up along the border there, making it very difficult for Russia to deny what they were doing, and calling NATO and calling UN, to order, to say, hey, like, this is a real issue that is happening. So it has a tactical advantage for Ukrainian defense, but it also has a political advantage for them rallying allied support around the world. It's really incredible, and that's something that even 10 years ago, if this kind of a conflict were going on, I don't think that type of imagery would have been as readily accessible, right? I think that the cultural mindset would have been, never reveal your sources and methods and what intel you have, right? As opposed to make it public so that people can see what the adversary is doing. So I think that's one major change. But the other thing is, when you think of other aspects of the satellite industry that are playing out and adding value to Ukraine's defense today, Deborah mentioned communications and Starlink, and that now you can very quickly replace telecom infrastructure that has been destroyed or didn't exist because you were in a rural area with quick deploy systems, either traditional geosynchronous satellite services or LEO services that are coming out from Starlink and OneWeb and others. But one of the other areas of satellites that I think is often forgotten or just taken for granted is position, navigation, and timing. I mean, you see these videos of somebody operating an unmanned drone and dropping a mortar down the open hatch of a tank, or an unmanned vessel attacking a capital ship of the Russian Navy in the Black Sea. Those things wouldn't be possible without access to precise position and navigation from GPS or Galileo in Europe. So you see it's Earth observation, it's communications, and it's position, navigation, and timing. All three of those satellite applications really being utilized heavily in Ukraine's defense.
Yeah, and the second question, it kind of follows on that, Dave, is this notion now that the involvement of the commercial sector, to some extent, may be upsetting the way the traditional national security apparatus, which we both know a little about, functions, protects information, conducts war, plans strategy and tactics. Do you see that as being problematic when 1,100 Silicon Valley companies come rushing into Ukraine, and the Ukrainian government, all pretty young people, very open to their situation for obvious reasons, say, yeah, let's implement this stuff. Let's effectively make it a laboratory. Do you see problems with that?
Well, I think there's two sides to the coin. The one that we've already talked about, which is that it levels the playing field for a relatively small country that has less of a national defense budget or can't afford to put its own space assets in orbit, can have near peer capability by leveraging commercial Earth imaging from companies like Maxar, communications from companies like Starlink or others. But at the same time, it does draw those companies into the geopolitical conflict. And I think there was quite a bit of early on news about that, where Starlink was designed to build really mass internet access via satellite for consumers, and found itself being used on the front lines of a potential war. And then now you have to ask yourself, okay, do I want to draw the ire of the adversary as a company? Do my shareholders accept that risk? Do my other customers, like Viasat, where we had the example there, who have nothing to do with what's going on, they could be impacted because the adversary could choose to take out that service or disrupt it in some way that impacts large other swaths of customers. So I think there is a balance there, and that is something that the whether it's Silicon Valley or any commercial company has to ask itself, to what extent it's willing to play a role there and to take that risk. And I think Starlink has really been one of the pioneer companies to sort of enter into that space and realize you can't be half in. You're either in or you're not, and you do risk offending somebody, right, on one side or the other. And we heard stories just recently, as a couple of days ago, that now their product is being used through gray market channels on the Russian side of the front, right? So again, you have difficulty policing those kinds of things. I think that is probably the biggest challenge for commercial companies.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. It's Stephen, kind of just turning that back to you. Obviously, there are risks, and David just laid them out for us pretty clearly. Do you see a challenge with this commercial government merger? I mean, you've worked on both sides of the street. You understand how our national security apparatus needs to work, how it's worked so effectively, through the years. What concerns you there?
Oh, and I think the point that David was making is completely valid, and it's certainly one that I think has been in the forefront of everybody's mind, especially for the past couple of years. But you could probably peel that back, several decades even before that. As the birth of the industry really was kicking off, I think there was always that kind of question of where does the government role start and stop, and where does the privatization begin?
Right.
And I personally see they're kind of intertwined. Let's look back in our history books. This whole industry got started because of government work, back in the Cold War era. There is a natural relationship between the two. I think the war in Ukraine has probably accelerated some of those issues in ways that we may not have thought about, 5 or 6 years ago. And it's one that I know we in my company and in many others in the industry take very seriously. We think about it. We think about security. We think about all kinds of, implications of what we're doing. But I think ultimately the greater good prevails. And that has always been the issue of this type of technology, is the good that it can provide, the transparency that it helps, show to people of the activities and events that are happening in the world, ultimately is one of our motivating forces.
Yeah, I've got a couple of more questions, but I know Joe Fargnoli of New York Space Alliance, my colleague here, has one. Joe, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Lou. I just wanted to key off something David said, where he mentioned that 10 years ago we would not have imagined how the commercial satellite industry might be used in a conflict like this. I thought that was very true. My question is, what does it look like 10 years from now? The Ursa piece talked about the new art of war. There was a time where not everyone had symmetric access to satellite technology, comm, imagery, GPS. We're in an era right now where have credit card can get access, generally speaking. So we're in a different strategic environment. My question is, what do you think it's going to look like 10 years from now? What will the new art of war look like 10 years from now? And what is it that will guarantee a nation's wealth and safety in that new environment?
Dave, you want to go first?
Sure.
Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry, David.
Yeah, sure. I think it's a great question. If you look at kind of an analogous segment of the space industry and think about GPS that you mentioned, right? Today it's pretty hard to imagine our lives without GPS receivers in our phones, in our cars. Everybody's just used to being able to track an order or a route to grandma's house on a digital map on a screen as an icon, and that's all empowered by GPS. But really, that has only become relatively recently available within the last 10 to 15 years. You started to see that become so ubiquitous. I think the question you raise is a good one, which is, today getting access to Earth imagery and the intelligence that it can offer typically requires a direct relationship with one of the companies like a Maxar, a Black Sky, Capella, somebody like that. And you can buy curated images. You can sign up for services to have those companies provide you what you're looking for, but you don't necessarily control it directly. So I think, I don't know if it's 10 years from now or a few years from now, but you could see a world where, an individual through a portal on a website could be able to personally go task a satellite over an area of interest for whatever reason. Now, that in tactical terms, that has a lot of value, but it also raises a lot of, ethical concerns. If I don't like the fact that my neighbor's dog is barking, can I task a satellite over his house and see what they're doing? So there will be, regulatory legal considerations to look at, but I think increasingly the access to space, the access to the technology and the output of space is going to increase over the next few years. And we're going to see, I think, in Earth imaging, the same kind of revolution we've seen in communications and in positioning and timing.
Yeah, but by the way, David, I just wrote a new business plan for that satellite that attacks barking dogs. Thank you for that. Stephen, you want to pick up on that question as well?
Yeah, I do. David, your point about GPS, I think, is spot on, and it's one that I think is often kind of compared to this industry and just the evolution from an imaging perspective. I think the other thing to think about, and I agree, I think the ubiquity of high resolution commercial satellite imagery, we're already seeing it. It's growing by leaps and bounds and will continue to do so. There was an interesting article in the New York Times just a couple of days ago talking about the implications on privacy. And this has, of course, been an issue that has come up for probably 30 years since really the birth of the commercial satellite imagery world. And the implications of what they were talking about in the New York Times article is, as the resolution gets better and better, what are the implications on privacy? And it always makes me pause. I mean, take it from who it's worth. And I'm a bit biased, I admit, from coming from the satellite imagery perspective. But just think about the prevalence of webcams. Think about the prevalence of security cameras that are in pretty much everybody's doorstep now. You know, your barking dog example. I'm not going to task a satellite. I'm going to put up my little Arlo home camera and be, you know, live time feeding it and showing it to whomever I need on my neighborhood network. So I think there's a bit of a sensational aspect that has always come with space-based satellite imagery.
Right.
You know, it's spy satellites from space. It always gets a headline. We're always laughing when we get articles and people say, you know, ... seen from space. Well, yeah, of course, you can see the Hoover Dam or, you know, the Great Aswan Dam or whatever the case may be, but it grabs a headline. And I wonder in the future, as this becomes even more ubiquitous, with all of the security and other implications we've already been talking about, you know, at what point does that sensational aspect begin to fade away a little bit? And it becomes another source of media and information that people use, as opposed to it being the provocative part. So that just a little side note from my perspective.
No, it's a great point. And again, it's up to groups like SSPI to continue to tell the narrative properly about what this industry does. But it's interesting, guys. Vera was writing in her piece about an IT army of 400,000 volunteer hackers that are now there helping to protect critical infrastructure and counter Russian cyber attacks. And one of the areas we got into was, gee, that could actually get into the wrong hands. You could have 400,000 North Koreans, young kids, just very hungry to, you know, to work the net for their country. Dave, I mean, is that a legitimate concern? Because it's already happening for the good guys in Ukraine. How do you see something like that playing out?
You know, it's a good question, right? I mean, any tool can be used for good or bad purposes, right? And I think that's really the challenge is how do companies attempt to regulate or make sure that their work product or the technology that they're developing is used for the greater good and not for some nefarious purpose. And that's pretty tough to do. You know, the example we were talking about earlier, where, you know, Starlink just wants to build a communication solution for people who can't get internet in rural places, and the next thing you know, they get drawn into a geopolitical conflict, and now their product is potentially being used on both sides of the front, right? It's difficult to regulate that. It's difficult to manage it, but you know, I think that is one of the concerns of any new technology. You hear a lot about this with AI. You know, once Pandora's box is open and it's now been released, you can't put it back. And so, you know, I think industry combined with government from a regulatory perspective will have to find ways to monitor the authenticity of data to make sure that the tools are being used the right way. But it's getting increasingly difficult to just label something as a dual use technology or an ITAR irregulated technology and prevent it from being exported, because it's being developed and being utilized all around the world. It's not all just coming from inside the US any longer.
Right, you're not going to keep it in a box. I did want to talk about peace, because that's what we're trying to understand here. But Stephen, I want to go back to you with one more question regarding something else that has been reported lately. And of course, Vera did a piece on it in the February 15th issue of Time, and that is the Russian anti-satellite capability report. And I recall back in October 2022 at the UN, Vladimir Yermakov, who is Russia's foreign minister, director of non-proliferation, and Arms Control warned the U.S. commercial infrastructure in outer space that it could be used, it could become a legitimate target, I believe he said, for retaliation. So Russia's been talking about knocking out satellites in 2022 for strategic purposes. Now, the latest reports, are what they are, but is there a concern there? And, again, Maxar is providing a service in space, but it's a commercial entity. Where do you see that argument going, or that fear?
Yeah, I mean, of course, it is a concern. I think anybody who owns and operates a satellite or depends on satellite technology has to be thinking about that. It doesn't stop what we're doing. It doesn't stop us from coordinating very closely with the people we need to coordinate with and to keep track of things. Obviously, I can't go into a whole lot of details in terms of what you would do to try and prevent or to warn of an attack. But it's an issue. I think it's likely to continue to become an issue for many other providers as well. And it's one that we have to stay in very close lockstep with our government clients, with the industry as a whole, and to stay coordinated on it. I don't have a whole lot more to offer on that.
No, I appreciate that. Let me talk about perhaps something as we move into a more peaceful, possibly a resolution to this conflict. The prospect of Ukraine joining NATO, there seems to be a red line issue for the Kremlin, as would be Russia's violation of NATO's Article 5. Dave, I'll start with you. I mean, could the satellite industry or some of the current tools of technology that are in place address the root cause need of Ukraine joining NATO or being protected without crossing the red line? Is there a possibility there, do you see?
Well, I think some of the tools that we've talked about, especially Earth imaging and some of the communications tools, can be used to provide data, right, to help provide forewarning of nefarious action. I mean, that's already happened, right? That happened even before the invasion took place. So potentially, I don't know if that replaces the need to be part of a joint security organization. I mean, we've seen Sweden and other countries that have remained neutral but have decided to join NATO, that they think it's worth the benefit of being part of that larger treaty organization. And of course, there's a lot of stuff in the news here with American politics at the moment about, would the U.S. posture change depending upon who's in the White House next year? So, yeah, I don't know. I think that's the implications of whether or not Ukraine joins NATO are much bigger than the satellite industry. I think satellite can be a tool that can help support the country before that happens or after it happens.
Yeah. Stephen, let me ask that question another way, because I know if I ask you that question, what you're going to say probably, but if we get to the point where we're having some level of negotiation about a resolution to the war, as we've done with nuclear nonproliferation using satellites to, ensure compliance, do you see a role for the Maxar news bureaus and others to be able to provide the kind of verification or analysis that might lead to more trust in a negotiation?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. So when we were just having that discussion, it actually brought me back again as somewhat of a student of history and one who's lived through it from both my government and commercial days. This isn't that dissimilar from the premise behind the Open Skies Treaty, as well as behind the ideas of like the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty, both of which were negotiated between the United States and NATO and the Warsaw Pact at the time, to really help verify and to prove or disprove allegations that there were territorial violations going on or preparations for military activities. So I very much see this could be in the future with a much greater capability than we have today than we did back in the late 80s, where a lot of these national technical means are being used as part of the verification. All of what we've talked about today, the abundance of commercial data, whether it's from communications to imaging satellites, all weather, all day, all night, all of those things help to provide much more clear information about military activities that could be used to destabilize an area. 100%. And from a news bureau perspective, Sure. I mean, that's what we really did leading up to the days, as you mentioned, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine 2 years ago. Is we saw it coming, as did many other people around the world, because you could see with very clear visual evidence forces that were being assembled on the border. That's exactly the type of idea behind a transparency dialogue for an arms treaty, is how do you prove or disprove that and make it more stable as opposed to destable.
Right. I think somebody said trust but verify many years ago.
That is exactly right.
Yeah. Joe, we're on a hopeful trajectory here. You got a hopeful question?
Yeah, I'll keep us on that path. So, folks, we want to move towards a world that's more peaceful and prosperous for all. That's going to guarantee our security. If we go forward 10 years and we think about where the world is going, where the satellite industry could go, what advice would you give the community today to get to a point in 10 years where we're closer to having, expanded peace and prosperity? What actions do you think the satellite industry should take, both in the startup community and the established space community, to be able to play that role so that 10 years from now, we can look back at this day, February 21st, 2024, and said, we began a revolution that led to a much more peaceful and prosperous world globally.
Yeah.
What would your advice be to the community today from your predicting where we could be in 10 years?
Dave?
David?
St. Thomas Aquinas meets AI.
It's a good question. I think that, the industry is already on a good track for finding ways to make space, the imagery, the asset of space as a communications mechanism, as a mechanism for timing and navigation, more accessible down to lower and lower levels in society, right? Down to the individual consumer. And kind of the example that we talked about earlier, GPS went from being a tool that was only used by military personnel for navigation to now every one of us has it in our personal phones. And I think continuing to drive access to the value proposition of satellite communications and timing and imagery, so it becomes part of everyday life and becomes sort of integral into what we're doing, I think is a worthy altruistic mission for the industry. One of the things that we find very rewarding at UltiSat, one of our customers are humanitarian relief organizations, the UNHCR, and actually we've sold quite a few terminals of Starlink terminals as well as other satellite communications terminals for humanitarian relief, particularly with regard to Ukraine, where you've got millions of people who have been displaced. They're leaving their own country with little more than the shirt on their back and having to figure out where to go and what to do. And they enter Poland, they enter Germany, they enter other countries, and a lot of times they're going to a UN refugee relief station. And multiple forms of satellite technology are being used at those stations in order to help reestablish a place for them to stay while the conflict is going on, and hopefully someday repatriate them back to their country when the conflict is over. So I think continuing to find ways, have industry continue to promote ways to use satellite technology for good, whether it's helping with crop yields, helping with climate monitoring, helping with returning displaced people to a well-founded life, I think are all good aspirations for the satellite industry.
Right, and again, UltiSat has won an award for that humanitarian work that you've done. Stephen, before we go to Joe for his New York Minute, I just want to ask you, again, you and David have both been around this industry and seen a lot for many, many years. What is it about our industry in this particular conflict that kind of blows you away? That it says, gosh, I knew we were good. I work at Maxar, but I didn't know we were this good. Is there something that you say, well, it really makes me feel good about what I'm seeing here? And, obviously we're going to fight for the right cause.
Yeah, I think, Lou, you and I probably even spoke about this not too long ago. People will often ask, as you think back over your career and all the different images you've looked at, what's been the one that stood out the most? Which is trying to say, pick your favorite kid. It's really difficult. There's so many notable, important things that our satellites have been able to cover and to report on, from aftermaths of just absolutely tragic natural disasters, Japanese earthquake, the tsunami, earthquakes, fires, floods, you name it, to, of course, the war in Ukraine. And as I think back to it, what I'm probably most proud of, and it touches on some of what Dave just talked about as well, and how do we move this all forward in 10 years, is making this this technology understandable and useful for people. To me, that's what motivates me every day. I'm a news junkie. I'm an imagery junkie. I love this stuff. I do it when they're not paying me for it. Don't tell my company that, because I just love it. I think it's fascinating to see the world at any spot in the world and to track things that are happening. But to me, I'm most proud about the ability of this industry to make it less sensational and more understandable. And that's what kind of inspires me about where it goes forward, and make this stuff useful. Make it so it's not just technology for technology's sake. Put it in the hands of people that they can actually be using it for good.
Yeah, give it a soul. Well said. Guys, we'll come back to you for some more questions and take some from the audience if they're out there. Thank you very much for this part of the segment. And Joe, what does the New York Alliance have to say? Give me a New York minute.
Well, Lou, I think we took a really close look at the relevancy of our industry and the role of commercial. If we really stand back and look at the examples we talked about, we see that commercial is changing the global balance of power. We talked about how one of the first things that happened in Ukraine was the attack on infrastructure, and what was termed the new art of war, right? How are the Chinese fighting without fighting? And we can see in this quiet, tension-filled world, commercial is playing a role to impact that balance. The proliferation of commercial and the pace of innovation is a discriminating strategic factor here, right? The nation that's the most innovative and innovates the quickest has a definitive advantage in this fast-paced, technology-driven world. I was really impressed with Stephen's presentation, the great work going on at Maxar News, the idea of chronicling and documenting the facts that are happening that go into the collective consciousness of what's really occurring in our world, the idea of getting data into the hands of people, going direct to users through cell phones. I was also really taken aback by David Myers' presentation of his company's work in providing what I would call telecom infrastructure resiliency, right? Knock out one form of communication, his company's there to deliver another. So a couple of really great companies doing things that are really changing the balance of power and how the world works with data. You know, I was really taken aback with the question of what is the new high ground? Assume everyone has infinite comms, infinite visibility, infinite PNT. What is the new high ground? What is the new art of war? And how does democratization of space force us to come to a new level of operating as humanity and looking at, you know, what are the new assets that really promote the well-being of humankind? So I got a lot of great insight for this conversation, but it really led me to think of what comes next. What will that next 10 years look like when all of this information and access has been somewhat equalized? What is the next thing that will help to promote the peace and prosperity of our nation and of the world? So very thought-provoking presentation. I really appreciate the contributions of the panel.
Yeah. And yours as well. Very well said. I mean, the whole goal here is to try to do good, whether it is defeating an enemy or, making the society a better place. I mean, that's what satellites do every minute of every day. And I think everybody on this panel today so far has addressed that. But there are risks, and they're enormous, and we're going to have to deal with them. Tamara, I believe before we go on to the next segment and ask a few more questions or bring in the audience, we've got some housekeeping.
We do indeed. So let me just open up the happy little slides. Let's see.
Yes. So we've got SSPYs with an event tomorrow, or with an event coming up tomorrow. It is tomorrow. Tamara, anything we need to know further about this event? You've got a link there.
Yeah, we've been talking about the global impact of our industry and how it kind of levels the playing field. This particular conversation is going to be talking about how to bring in folks from marginalized or underserved communities. Dr. Heidi Ann White has actually done some work in Africa and with the indigenous communities in Canada. And so we're excited to hear her thoughts on how to bring them into STEM education fields and ultimately into our own industry.
Very good. And the women in our audience who are not familiar with SSPI WISE, we encourage you to check it out. You don't need to be a member of SSPI to be participating in SSPI WISE, but it's always a good idea to be a member of SSPI. It's $100 a year for individuals. So we encourage you to check that out. That's our fastest growing special interest group. What else is going on, Tamara? What else? Ah, yes, March 5th. We're going to be in London. We've exported this roundtable. We're going to have one in London now, thanks to Hogan Lovells. And we'll be talking about opportunities and challenges in the commercial space and satellite industry in London with some folks from Seraphim, the venture capital investment group, and Tony Azzarelli. And we'll have Astroscale involved with that, as well as our friends from Hogan Lovells. And the UK Space Industries Director of Championing Space will be giving a keynote. And that'll be a great event. That's a live event. So if you're going to be in London on March 5th, please join us. You can register online at sspi.org/events. And if you're not planning to be in London, you might as well plan to be there. It's a great place
Lou,
to be.
I've heard that's the second best space roundtable in the world.
It is. It is right now. It's number 2. They're waiting to get into the playoffs. See how they do. And we're going to be live in New York next week. Although we're not going to be on the 3rd Wednesday of the month. We'll be on the 4th Wednesday of the month because of the satellite conference in Washington. But we'll be at Milbank Law, a competing law firm here in Hudson Yards. And again, you're all welcome to that. And Tamara, that tees off at 12:30.
Yeah, so no. Let me just give us some updates. So if you scan the QR code there, it'll take you to the registration for the live event, which launches at noon. There'll be lunch, very light lunch served. But the roundtable will actually start slightly later because I'm sure those of you who cannot make it live would not like to watch us chewing food. So we'll be picking up the actual roundtable around 12:30. If you're registered today, you are actually already registered for the hybrid event.
So yeah, and I'll tell you, they have the best food in Milbank. Yeah. I'm not kidding. It's really good. And if you've never seen Hudson Yards in New York City, it's a beautiful setting as well. So we'll be talking with moderators from the satellite conference, and we're going to be asking them, what didn't you hear at satellite? Because these conferences tend to be echo chambers after a while, right? And things don't get said. You know, they're not like these conversations. So we're actually going to be asking the moderators about some things that they didn't hear at satellite. And I think that's what we have for announcements, Tamara. Yes?
Yeah, that is it.
Okay, and I will show up at the rehearsal next time. We're going to go to questions for Stephen and Dave. David, looks like there's one from Robin Frank. And Robin, you're welcome to come on and ask this, or I can ask it for you. Does Robin want to come on?
Let's see. Okay, I'm looking here. I don't see Robin saying she wants to come. Robin, let me unmute
All right,
you.
well, I'll ask.
She's waving at us. Hi, Robin.
Robin, do you want to meet David and Steve?
Sure. Hi, gentlemen. The question was directed particularly at Steve Wood. You talked early on in your remarks about the neutrality of what Maxar is doing. And, you know, as a jaded New Yorker, I wonder whether there's any such thing as neutral media, and would appreciate your speaking further to it. Thank you.
Well, welcome to the New York Space Business Roundtable, Stephen.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I have to admit, so
Thanks,
one of my bias right up front from the very, very beginning, when people told me I was going to be working with the media, I had much the similar reaction. Especially coming from my government days, I found it hard to believe that there was any neutral or unbiased media. But here's the way I look at it now, the way I would typically see it on a given day. The beauty of what satellite imagery does is it's the facts. Now, how people use it and interpret it and apply it could be affected by people's bias. But what we're really focused on is the facts, and we'll collect imagery, we'll show what's happening. One of the current issues we're dealing with literally today is watching the Egyptians building a huge new area right along the border with Gaza. And it's unassailable when you see it. You can see the area that's being cleared, but we're not giving a whole lot of political commentary. In fact, we're not giving any commentary on the reasons behind it or the implications. We're showing what today's imagery looks like. And we're identifying the construction, we're showing activity that is without a political slant or agenda to it. And that's the way I typically look at it. I can't certainly speak for the various media organizations that we work with and provide our imagery to, because they may indeed have their own political bias or military bias along the way. But our job is to be as neutral as we possibly can be and to provide the facts. The old just the facts, man.
You, sir.
Thank you, Robin. Thanks for that question. David, I think the power of the satellite industry is that it's collegial, that it does tend to be, more focused on getting the information moved along, as Stephen said, and letting others decide, right? I could use another cliche, but I won't. Do you see that continuing, and do you see that as a strength of the industry, or are things evolving in another direction now?
I do. I think one of the challenges that the industry has is that some of the new products that are coming out, whether it's particularly in the communication sector where, I tend to focus, there are new products that are now more off the shelf, like Starlink, OneWeb, Amazon's Kuiper is coming out here shortly, Lightspeed, various others. And so one of the things that is changing is the way satellite products and services are being distributed. So, it used to be if you wanted to build a satellite communications network, you went to an integrator and they would figure out which satellites to be on and what terminals to use and where to land it and how to stitch that all together and drop the traffic. Now it's very much a off-the-shelf internet access kind of service. And that's good and bad. The good side of it is it makes it more accessible to customers. The performance is better. The cost per bit is lower. But the bad side of it means that there are a lot of folks out there in the retail chain, if you will, that are selling the product that aren't necessarily informed. They're Bob's bait, tackle, and satellite sales. It's just one of many things they do. They're not experts at it. The wrong product gets sold to the end customer. Expectations aren't necessarily set. And so I think the advice that I would have to sort of all of the major suppliers of emerging products, whether it's a Earth observation solution or whether it's communications or something else, is to make sure that you vet your channel partners and make sure that they are qualified and that they're going to represent your product well, that they're going to represent the needs of the customer well. Because the world is fickle, right? And if somebody has a bad experience with a technology or a product, and in a culture where a negative opinion can get sent out by somebody's thumbs on a social media feed very quickly, it can have a negative impact. So I think that's an important aspect of the evolution as it continues to evolve with sort of this multi-tiered distribution approach.
Yeah. We've only got a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to ask, this is kind of a yes or no question, but in Vera Bergengruen, in Vera's cover story on AI in Ukraine, she writes about a very strategic decision that the Ukrainians are making to build a tech sector that after the war will, hopefully, if it goes the right way, enable Ukraine to look perhaps more like Israel than it ever has before. Based on what the three of you know about technology, and that's an awful lot, and economic development. Stephen, is that realistic?
I assume it's realistic. To me, what is forefront of my mind is the reconstruction that has to happen in the meantime. This is a country that's been at war in a way that I haven't seen since, World War II in terms of the history books.
Right.
It's a daunting challenge. I think if there's one thing that I've been most impressed by the Ukrainians is their will to keep fighting and their perseverance. So I think it's certainly possible, and I wish them the best for them.
Yeah, Joe?
I agree with Stephen, absolutely.
Okay. David, last word to you. on
Yeah,
that.
I agree. I think assuming that the military conflict is over and they're given the opportunity to get into a reconstruction, absolutely. I mean, you think back even in the Soviet Union era, Ukraine was a big base of aerospace and technology intelligence for that country. So I think absolutely they've got the history to build their own capabilities.
Just the one thing I'll add, Lou, is we've got to really be
Sure.
conscientious of the democratization of technology these days. With the cloud, with AI, this is a place where anyone with an internet connection and a laptop can be highly influential. So there's a lot of self-determination that's possible by a country like Ukraine or others as well.
And as we've been saying all along, the speed with which that can happen in a positive direction is equal to the counterweight where things can go bad as they've gone in Ukraine the last 2 years. So we'll keep our fingers crossed. Again, our industry will play a role in the peace as it does in the war. So, gentlemen, thank you so much. David Myers, Stephen Wood, Joe Fargnoli, for making the time for us.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Really
Deborah
excellent
Werner.
conversation, and thank you everyone in the chats.
And thank you, Tamara, and thank the team, Ari, and everyone for scrambling like crazy today to get this right. And thank you, audience, for showing up and the great chats. We really appreciate it, and hope to see you in London or in New York. Take care,
Or
everybody.
both.
Bye.
Thanks again, Dave.
Thank you.